Serafina Devereux stood in the corridor outside the portrait gallery, staring at the empty space on the wall where her likeness used to hang. It had been removed 20 years ago, the day her mother died. No one ever explained why. No one needed to. The stain on this family's name. Her stepmother, Lady Cordelia Devereux, said it so often it had stopped sounding like an insult and started sounding like a fact everyone accepted without question. Her stepsisters, Marguerite and Isolde, drifted past her in the hallway that morning, silk skirts hissing against the floor, and did not so much as glance her way. When Isolde did speak, it was only to laugh behind a gloved hand and murmur something to Marguerite that made them both smile, the way people smile when they know they're being cruel and don't care. Serafina had long since stopped waiting for her father to look at her. He passed her in the breakfast room without a word, the same as every morning, his eyes fixed somewhere just past her shoulder, as if she were furniture that had been moved into the wrong room. The servants whispered. She heard it in the way conversations died when she entered a room, in the way the younger maids studied her with a mixture of pity and fear, as though disgrace might be contagious. No one asked what she had actually done. They simply knew, the way people know the sky is blue, that Serafina Devereux was the family's shame, and that was the end of it. What no one saw was where she went after the house went quiet. The estate ledgers, neglected for years, now balanced themselves under her careful hand. The tenant children who couldn't read now knew their letters because she taught them in secret, in the old gamekeeper's cottage, using candle stubs no one would miss. The Whitmore family, 3 fields over, had food this winter because someone left grain sacks at their door before dawn and never said who. The estate library, once rotting with damp and neglect, had been quietly restored, book by book, shelf by shelf, by hands no one thanked. She did all of it, without asking for forgiveness she was never going to receive. Only, sometimes, in the hush after midnight, she let herself wonder, not why the family hated her, but what she had supposedly done to deserve it. No one had ever told her. Perhaps no one alive still remembered the truth. The question came, unannounced, on a grey Tuesday afternoon. A royal courier rode through the gates at speed, his horse lathered, his coat marked with a crest Serafina had never seen, a black wolf beneath a broken crown. Within the hour, the entire household had gathered in the drawing room, breathless with the news. The Duke of Blackthorn, cold, unmarried, and famously untouchable, was coming to Ashford Manor. Every eye in the room turned toward Marguerite and Isolde. No one thought to look at Serafina at all. The manor had not seen this much commotion in years. Lady Cordelia commanded the household like a general, preparing for war. Seamstresses were summoned. The good china was unpacked. Marguerite tried on 4 gowns before breakfast and declared none of them worthy of a duke. "He will choose tonight," Isolde said, admiring herself in the hall mirror. "Mark me, a man like that doesn't travel this far for anything less than a bride." Serafina was given no gown, no seat at the table, no place in the receiving line. She was told, plainly, to remain upstairs until the family required her, which was to say, never. She didn't mind. She had long ago stopped expecting an invitation to her own life, but curiosity got the better of her, and she slipped down the servants' stair to watch from the gallery above the entrance hall, hidden behind the balustrade, the way she used to watch her mother greet guests before everything changed. The Duke of Blackthorn arrived exactly on time, which seemed to unsettle her father more than if he'd been late. He was tall, dark-coated, and utterly still, in a way that made the rest of the room look frantic by comparison. He did not smile at Marguerite's curtsy. He did not linger on Isolde's carefully arranged beauty. His eyes swept the hall once, briskly, like a man checking a room for something misplaced. Lord Devereux stepped forward, all practiced warmth. "Your Grace, welcome to Ashford Manor. May I present my daughters? Where is Lady Serafina Devereux?" The words landed like a dropped glass. For a moment, no one moved. Marguerite's smile froze mid-curve. Isolde's fan stopped fluttering. Lady Cordelia's face went the color of old paper. "Your Grace," her father said carefully, "I believe there's been some confusion. My daughters are—" "I asked for Lady Serafina." The Duke's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Not her sisters. Her. Above them, hidden in the shadows of the gallery, Serafina went very still. She had never heard her name spoken like that in this house, not as an accusation, not as a whisper of shame, but plainly, as though it were simply a fact that mattered. "She is indisposed," Lady Cordelia managed. "Unwell. Not fit to receive guests of your standing. Then I will wait until she is fit. Your Grace, surely my other daughters—" "I did not travel 3 days to meet your other daughters." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Serafina had ever heard. Her father's jaw tightened. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but you have never set foot in this house. How do you know my daughter Serafina at all?" The Duke turned, and for the first time, his gaze lifted, not toward the family gathered before him, but toward the gallery above, toward the shadows where a girl in a plain grey dress stood frozen behind the railing. Serafina's breath caught. He couldn't possibly see her, and yet, for one unbearable second, it felt as though he did. "That," the Duke said quietly, turning back to her stunned father, "is not a question I intend to answer tonight." He removed his gloves, unhurried, and handed them to a waiting servant. "I understand dinner is being prepared. I won't be sitting for it. Not until Lady Serafina joins the table herself." Lady Cordelia's mouth opened and closed without sound. The Duke of Blackthorn simply stood there, patient as stone, waiting for a girl the family had spent years trying to erase. Serafina came down because refusing was no longer an option. Not with the Duke of Blackthorn standing in the entrance hall, refusing dinner on her account, in front of every servant and neighbor who would talk about it for weeks. She wore the same plain grey dress. She hadn't been given time or permission to change. When she entered the dining room, conversation stopped. Marguerite's eyes narrowed. Isolde looked faintly ill. Her father wouldn't meet her gaze at all. The Duke rose from his seat. No one had ever risen for her before. "Lady Serafina," he said, and pulled out the chair directly beside his own, not down the table where the family had clearly intended to seat her, if they'd intended to seat her at all. "Thank you for joining us." She sat, carefully, aware of every eye in the room. She expected him to ask the usual things, her age, her accomplishments, perhaps some polite cruelty disguised as small talk. Instead, once the first course was cleared, he asked about the estate's eastern boundary and whether the drainage repairs from 2 winters ago had held through the spring floods. The table went quiet in a different way this time, confused, not scornful. "They held," Serafina said slowly. "I reinforced the channel near the tenant cottages myself, after the first repair failed. With Aldous Whitmore's help, I understand. He mentioned it to one of my men." She stared at him. "Your men have spoken to the Whitmore family. I make it a habit to know the estates I intend to visit." He said it simply, without apology, though something in his tone suggested it was not habit at all, that this had taken months, not days. He asked about the library next, how she'd sourced replacement bindings for the water-damaged volumes, where she'd learned to read old estate ledgers well enough to catch an error the family's own steward had missed for 6 years. He asked about the tenant children, about which families still struggled through winter, about a schoolhouse that didn't yet exist but clearly should. He was not flirting. He was not performing charm the way suitors did with Marguerite. He was listening, and worse, he already knew half the answers before she gave them. "You've been investigating me," Serafina said finally, quiet enough that only he could hear. "Yes. For how long?" "Not you directly at first. I was searching the Eastern County records for the girl who helped me at the gamekeeper's cottage years ago. When I traced your name to Ashford Manor, my men uncovered the local whispers about how you quietly balanced the neglected estate ledgers and taught the tenant children to read. Longer than you'd believe." Across the table, Lady Cordelia's knuckles had gone white around her wine glass. Isolde leaned toward Marguerite, whispering something behind her fan, her eyes darting between Serafina and the Duke with open suspicion. When dinner ended, the Duke did not linger over dessert wine with her father, as custom demanded. Instead, he turned to Lord Devereux directly. "I have a request. Anything, Your Grace." Her father's voice had the particular strain of a man who suspected he was about to regret his own words. "I would like Lady Serafina to come to Blackthorn Castle for several weeks." The room went utterly still. "As my personal advisor," the Duke added, before anyone could mistake his meaning. "Not as a guest, not as a prospective bride. I need her knowledge of estate records, archival history, and family correspondence. Her skills are considerable." Lady Cordelia's composure cracked at last. "Your Grace, surely one of my own daughters would be better suited to— I have made my request." His tone did not invite argument. "I trust it will be honored." Serafina sat frozen in her chair, heart hammering, as her father, for the first time in 3 years, looked directly at her. Not with warmth, not with an apology, but with something new, something careful, as though he were seeing a stranger sit where his daughter used to be. She didn't understand any of it yet. Not why the Duke had come, not what he already knew about her, not why her name alone had been enough to bring him 3 days' ride from Blackthorn. But she understood one thing clearly. Whatever this was, it had started long before tonight. Blackthorn Castle was nothing like Serafina expected. She had imagined cold stone and colder silence, a place that matched its master's reputation. Instead, she found a household running with quiet precision, servants who greeted her by name, and a study lined floor to ceiling, with records no one had touched in decades. "This is where you'll be working," the Duke said, leading her through the heavy oak door on her first morning. Dust hung in the light from the tall windows. Ledgers, journals, and bundles of correspondence sat stacked in uneven towers across every surface. Working on what, exactly? Answers. He wouldn't say more than that at first. For 2 days, she simply catalogued, sorting decades of estate records into some kind of order, the same work she'd done at Ashford, without anyone noticing or caring. Here, the Duke noticed everything. He sat across from her most afternoons, reading correspondence in silence, occasionally asking her opinion on a name or a date, as though her judgment actually mattered. It was the 3rd night when she found the gap. An entire section of the Blackthorn family archive, nearly 6 years of correspondence and household records, had been removed. Not lost, removed. The binding showed clean cuts where pages had been sliced free, and the ledger index referenced entries that simply weren't there anymore. "Someone erased this on purpose," she said, showing him the mutilated pages. The Duke's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "I know. You knew before I found it. I suspected. I needed someone who could read what remained and tell me what was missing. Someone who understands estate records the way you do." He met her gaze. "That's why you're here, Lady Serafina. Not for company. For this." She should have felt used. Instead, strangely, she felt something closer to relief, to be wanted for what she actually knew, rather than dismissed for what she'd supposedly done. They worked together most nights after that, poring over what remained. Half-burned letters, a housekeeper's diary with pages torn out, a ledger where certain names had been scratched through so hard the pen had torn the paper. Slowly, carefully, they began piecing together fragments of a story someone had worked very hard to bury. Their partnership shifted in those weeks. He stopped speaking to her as an advisor and started speaking to her as an equal, asking her thoughts on a theory before offering his own, deferring to her reading of an old hand's penmanship, trusting her instincts when a discovery didn't add up. She found herself waiting for his knock at the study door each evening, for the particular quiet focus that settled over him when they were close to something. It wasn't romance, not yet. It was something steadier, trust, built one late night at a time, between 2 people who'd both learned not to expect kindness from anyone. Then, on a rain-soaked evening in early autumn, Serafina found her. A name, written in her mother's unmistakable hand, tucked inside a bundle of blackthorn correspondence, dated more than 20 years past. Not once. Repeatedly. Letters, ledger entries, a single line in an old guest register. Her mother's name, inside the private family records of a house she had supposedly never visited. Serafina stared at the page until the ink blurred. "Why is my mother's name in your family's archive?" The Duke went very still, staring at the same page over her shoulder, his jaw tight. "I don't know," he said quietly, "but I intend to find out." Neither of them said what they were both thinking, that whatever this was, it reached further back and ran far deeper than either of them had understood when this search began. It took 3 more weeks to find the truth, and when it came all at once. The Duke had sent riders to retrieve records from a solicitor's office in the city. Old correspondence his father had filed away and never destroyed, only forgotten. They arrived in a locked case, and Serafina and the Duke sat up past midnight breaking the seal together. Inside were letters between her mother, Genevieve Devereux, and the late Duke of Blackthorn, the current Duke's father. Not love letters. Business correspondence, warm but proper, concerning a joint venture between the two families, an investment in shipping routes that, for a brief time, had made both houses considerably wealthier. They were partners, Serafina murmured, reading a letter dated 21 years past. "My mother and your father. That's why her name is in your archives." "There's more," the Duke said, and slid a second document across the table. It was a forged letter, a crude copy of her mother's handwriting, close enough to fool most eyes, accusing Genevieve Devereux of siphoning funds from the joint venture and passing information to a rival house. Beneath it, a genuine letter from the elder Duke, furious, ending the partnership and severing all ties. "This is what destroyed her," Serafina whispered. "This one letter. A forgery," the Duke said grimly. "My father never questioned it. Why would he? It looked exactly like her hand." Serafina's throat tightened. She remembered fragments of that year, her mother growing quiet, then ill, then gone within 2 winters, while the family's fortunes and reputation collapsed around her like a house with its foundation quietly removed. No one had ever told Serafina why. She had simply grown up inside the wreckage, absorbing the shame as though it were her inheritance. "My mother never betrayed anyone," she said. "She wouldn't have known how to lie if her life depended on it." "I believe you." The Duke's voice was low, certain. "The handwriting is close, but not exact. Whoever forged this knew your mother's hand well enough to imitate it, which means it wasn't a stranger. It was someone inside your own household." The words settled over Serafina like cold water. Inside her own household. Someone who had access to her mother's letters, her mother's ledgers, her mother's private study. Someone with reason to want Genevieve Devereux ruined, and reason enough to let her daughter carry the disgrace for 20 years afterward. "Who," Serafina said quietly, "would do this to us?" The Duke didn't answer immediately. He was staring at the forged letter, turning it toward the lamplight, studying the particular slant of a capital G. "I don't know yet," he said, "but whoever wrote this took extraordinary care to make sure the truth never surfaced. Which tells me 2 things, Lady Serafina." "What things?" "That your mother's innocence was worth destroying a family to hide." He set the letter down. "And that someone in that house has spent 20 years making certain you never asked the right questions." Serafina thought of her stepmother's cold eyes across every dinner table, her stepsister's careless cruelty, her father's refusal to ever look at her directly, and felt, for the first time, that the shame she'd carried her whole life did not belong to her at all. It belonged to whoever had written that letter, and she intended to find out who. The forged letter went missing 3 days after they found it. Serafina had locked it in the study's writing desk herself, the key kept on a chain she never removed. When she opened the drawer that morning, the letter was simply gone. No broken lock, no sign of forced entry. because the master key to the estate's older furnishings had hung in the housekeeper's pantry, untouched for a decade, and Isolde knew precisely where to find it, as though it had never existed at all. "Someone in this house had a key," the Duke said, his voice flat with controlled fury. "Or someone let them in." It was the first crack in what had seemed, until then, a careful and private investigation. More followed quickly. A stable hand who'd once mentioned seeing a stranger deliver letters to Ashford Manor 20 years ago suddenly couldn't recall the conversation at all, and left Blackthorn's employ within the week, paid, the Duke suspected, to forget. A solicitor's clerk who'd helped locate the original case of documents failed to arrive for a scheduled meeting in the city. When the Duke sent a man to check on him, the clerk had vanished from his lodgings entirely. "They know we're close," Serafina said one evening, watching the Duke pace the length of the study. "They've known longer than that." He stopped at the window, jaw tight. "Someone has been protecting this secret for 20 years. They won't let a season's worth of digging undo it now." The attempt on the Duke's life came a week later. He'd ridden out at dawn to inspect the eastern boundary, a route he took often enough that anyone watching the household would know it well. A shot rang out from the tree line as he crossed the ridge, close enough to graze his horse's flank and send the animal bolting, close enough that a few inches either way would have ended everything. He returned to the castle pale and furious, refusing a physician, refusing to rest, insisting instead that they were closer to the truth than either of them had realized. "They're afraid," Serafina said, steadying her own shaking hands as she cleaned a shallow cut along his temple where a branch had caught him during the fall. "Which means we're right." It was that same night, in the quiet after the household had gone still, that the Duke finally told her what his own investigators had uncovered, the piece he'd been holding back until he was certain. "Your family's estate carries an old clause," he said, "buried in your grandfather's will. If your mother's name is ever formally cleared, if the forgery is exposed and her innocence proven, the estate reverts legally to her line. To you, Lady Serafina. Not to your father's second marriage. Not to your stepsisters." Serafina went very still. "The entire estate. Everything. Which means whoever destroyed your mother's reputation didn't do it out of spite. They did it to secure an inheritance that was never meant to be theirs." The truth settled over her like a physical weight. 20 years of being called a stain, a shame, a disgrace her family had been forced to endure. None of it had ever been about her mother's supposed betrayal at all. It had been about money, about land, about a woman willing to bury her own stepdaughter alive under a lie, rather than lose what she'd stolen. "Lady Cordelia," Serafina whispered. The Duke's silence was answer enough. "There's something else," he said carefully. "My men learned it only yesterday. Your eldest stepsister, Isolde, has known the truth for years, perhaps her entire life." Serafina thought of every cold glance, every whispered cruelty, every moment Isolde had watched her suffer, with something colder than indifference in her eyes, and understood, finally, that it hadn't been cruelty at all. It had been guilt, dressed up as contempt, worn by a girl who'd known exactly what her mother had done, and said nothing for 20 years. The season's grand ball was held at Ashford Manor that year, a tradition Lady Cordelia had fought hard to secure. One final display of the family's standing before. Unknown to her, everything she'd built on a lie began to fall apart. Serafina hadn't been meant to attend. She wasn't given a gown, wasn't listed among the family's guests, and wasn't expected to appear at all. But the Duke had sent word 3 days prior, a single line in his own hand: "Wear white. Come to the ballroom at 9. Trust me." She trusted him more than she trusted anyone left in that house. The gown arrived the morning of the ball, ivory silk, simple and exquisite, with no note attached, save his seal pressed into the box. She wore it without knowing why, only that he had asked. The ballroom glittered with candlelight and speculation. All of society had gathered for what everyone assumed was inevitable. The Duke of Blackthorn, after a season of mysterious behavior, was finally going to announce his engagement. Marguerite and Isolde had spent the week convinced it would be one of them. Half the eligible ladies in the room believed the same of themselves. The Duke arrived precisely at 9, dressed in unrelieved black, and crossed the ballroom floor without pausing to greet a single hostess or heiress, angling for his attention. He walked directly to Serafina, standing quietly near the edge of the room, where she'd been told to remain unseen. The music faltered. Conversation died in waves as heads turned to follow him. "Lady Serafina," he said, loud enough to carry, "will you do me the honor of this dance?" She barely remembered accepting. She barely remembered the steps. All she could feel was the weight of every eye in the room, the particular silence of a family, watching its careful lies begin to unravel in real time. When the dance ended, the Duke didn't release her hand. Instead, he turned to face the entire ballroom, her father pale near the refreshment table, Lady Cordelia gripping her fan hard enough to bend it, Isolde and Marguerite frozen mid-whisper. "For 20 years, the Duke said, his voice carrying easily across the stunned room. This family called Lady Serafina Devereux its greatest shame. Gasps rippled outward. Lady Cordelia's face was drained of color. "I have spent this season learning exactly why." His gaze swept the room, cold and deliberate. "The woman your family buried in shame possesses more honor than every title gathered in this room tonight." He turned back to Serafina, and for the first time since she'd known him, something in his expression softened entirely. "I am not here to choose a bride from England's celebrated ladies," he said. "I came for the one lady this family tried to erase." He knelt, right there before the entire aristocracy, and asked for her hand. The ballroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, someone's champagne glass shattering against the floor. Serafina could see her father's face crumbling in real time, the slow horror of a man realizing every belief he'd built his household on had been a lie. "There is one more matter," the Duke said, rising, still holding her hand, his voice pitched now only for her. "This was never simply a proposal, Serafina. It's the final legal step in something much larger, something I'll explain tonight, in full." Across the room, Lady Cordelia had gone rigid as stone, and Isolde would not lift her eyes from the floor at all. Serafina understood, with sudden clarity, that whatever came next would end everything her stepmother had spent 20 years protecting. The truth came out within a fortnight, laid before a magistrate with the full weight of evidence the Duke had spent a season gathering. The forged letter, the solicitor's original records, recovered from a second copy the Duke's father had kept without anyone realizing. A handwriting expert who testified, plainly, that the letter accusing Genevieve Devereux had been written by a hand trained to imitate hers, trained, as it turned out, by years of forging her signature on household accounts long before the scandal ever broke. Lady Cordelia did not deny it in the end. She couldn't. The inheritance clause, the timing, the forged hand, it all pointed in one direction, and when Isolde finally broke under her own guilt and confirmed what she'd known since childhood, there was nothing left to protect. Lady Cordelia lost everything: her place in the household, her standing in society, the fortune she'd spent 2 decades protecting through a dead woman's ruined name. Isolde, who had known the truth and said nothing, while a girl her own age was called a stain for 20 years, found herself shunned by the same drawing rooms that once fought for her attention. Marguerite, innocent of the scheme but tainted by association, retreated from society altogether. Serafina's mother's name was cleared in full, publicly, in the same newspapers that had once whispered about her supposed betrayal. The estate reverted to Serafina exactly as her grandfather's will had always intended, not as a gift, not as charity, but as what had been hers by right all along. Her father tried, once, to explain himself. Serafina listened and forgave him quietly, though something between them never fully mended. Some silences last too long to unteach. "I don't understand," the Duke said to her one evening, weeks later, as they walked the restored library at Ashford together. "You have every right to hate them. Your stepmother destroyed your mother. Your family let you carry the shame for it. And yet I've never once heard you speak of revenge." Serafina considered the question honestly before answering, "Because hatred would have made me exactly what they believed I was." He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable behind his eyes. Then, quietly, he told her the last thing he'd been keeping from her. "There's a reason I came to Ashford in the first place," he said, "before I knew about the forgery, before I knew any of it. I came because of something that happened years ago, long before either of us understood who the other truly was." He told her of a storm, a boy of perhaps 10, lost and soaked through on unfamiliar land after his carriage broke an axle near the Ashford border. He'd knocked on doors that turned him away, servants too wary of strangers to risk their positions. Only one door had opened. A girl, younger than him, had let him into a small cottage on the estate grounds, given him bread and a blanket and a book to keep him company by candlelight until his family's men found him at dawn. She'd never asked his name. She'd simply seen a frightened child and done what kindness required. "That was you," the Duke said. "I never forgot it. I spent years trying to learn who that girl had been, and when I finally traced her name, I found a household calling her its greatest shame." Serafina's eyes filled, the memory surfacing slowly, distantly, from a childhood she barely remembered as happy. "I never knew who you were. I wasn't searching for a bride, Serafina. I was searching for the girl who taught me what compassion looked like, long before I had any reason to believe in it." That winter, her mother's portrait was restored to its place in the Ashford Gallery, hung once more beside the family she'd been torn from. Proof, at last, that the woman they'd called a traitor had never been anything but innocent. And beside it, for the first time in 3 years, hung a portrait of her daughter. Not the family's shame, its greatest honor. If you made it to the end of this story, I want to say thank you. Please drop your thoughts in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe to Duke Tales. My Mia, turn on your notification button so you don't miss any episode.